Interviewing Dr. J. Paul Mitchell, Emeritus Professor of Urban Planning and History for the Ball State Oral History Project. The date is November 18th, 2004. Paul, I want to begin by thanking you for agreeing to help with my study. And I'd like to start our interview, if I may, with you telling me about your educational background before you came to Ball State. What I'm after in this question is sort of to get you from Wisconsin, since I know that's where you're from, to Ball State.
Okay. Well, I started out, as most of us did, as a child. I was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I went to school in a 8th grade, K through 8 school called Berryville School, which was just outside of the city limits, but still within the Kenosha Consolidated School District.
How do you spell Berryville?
Just the way it sounds.
B-E-R-R-Y.
B-I-L-L-E.
Okay.
So I went there at the age of 5 to kindergarten, and after that, there were 2 grades in each room, 1st and 2nd, 3rd and 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. It was one of the larger such schools in the district because it was along Sheridan Road, which goes all the way from Chicago to past Milwaukee. And so it was quite close to Lake Michigan. I grew up right on the shores of Lake Michigan, literally. And so there were a lot of kids there, but that meant there were probably about 17 to 20 kids in each grade. One of the big events in that was that in the 3rd grade, without my being consulted in any way, I was only there for about a week and then got pushed up into the 4th grade along with my best friend Dickie Asbeth. So I didn't even know what was happening, but I went through 3rd grade in a week. That has meant that I got through school early and that I was 20 when I graduated from college. So I've always been the youngest kid, and in my growing years, certainly the smallest and puniest kid in my class. After Berryville, we then had to go into the city of Kenosha. There were 3 junior highs, which were at that time 7 through 9 grade, and for some reason the closest one wasn't good enough for my parents. They sent me to one clear on the other side of town, Lincoln Junior High. So I was there for 1 year and had to take a bus, public transportation. We didn't have school buses for us then. Public transportation into the city, and then a city bus that took me to the south side. After the 9th grade, then Kenosha High School, or Mary E. Bradford High was its official name. It was the only high school in the city of over 60,000. There were 2,000 to 2,500 students in those 3 grades. My high school curriculum included taking Latin, 3 years of Latin, which was unusual. Lots of kids took 2, but not very many took 3. So we studied Virgil my 3rd year, and the other kind of traditional high school stuff. When I was a senior, I thought I would go to college. That was never in doubt. But my parents were not in a position to send me any place. They had no funds to do that. So I went in to see the counselor, who in those days was somebody like maybe the typing teacher who did this an hour a day or something. I walked into her office and I said, I want to go to college and I need to have my whole way paid. She said, well, I just happen to have something right here on my desk, and handed me a brochure about this full ride, 4-year, all expenses paid scholarship to Knox College. And I said, where is Knox College? And she looked closely and said, it's in Galesburg, Illinois. I had never heard of it before, but the idea of a free ride, you know, not just tuition, but room, board, and board were included as well. Whatever you needed. So I applied for that. I also applied to the University of Chicago, and I have no idea why But that's where I thought I wanted to go. I knew nothing about colleges and universities at the time, but somehow, maybe I'd been to Chicago and had once been on the campus there, and it looked like, you know, it looked like a really good school ought to look. And of course, they had a very small undergraduate program at the time. I didn't get the full ride scholarship, but I did get a scholarship. It was the first school that responded to me, and I was absolutely elated. So I took, it was a full tuition scholarship, plus they would try to find me a job in town or something like that. So I took that. About 10 days later, I got a letter from the University of Chicago offering me a free tuition and all the other things. It never occurred to me that I could take back my word to Knox College. But if Chicago had sent me the letter, I would have gone there. My life would have been totally different.
You're right, that's for sure.
I mean, really different.
Yeah.
Including, you know, not having met my
Right.
current wife
That's right.
and all of that. So that was a kind of I thought about that later, you know, and then I found out that people reneged on offers like that and said, well, I'm coming, but no, I'm not going to come.
Right.
It just never occurred to me you could do that. Would I have if I'd known I could? Probably, but I didn't. So I went to Knox, and I had never been there before. My mother and my oldest sister drove me down there, everything I owned in about 2 suitcases. And literally, I mean, that was it. And I got there, and I can remember I was so disappointed because I had this image of the University of Chicago, with these Gothic building, well, of the, you know, cloistered kind of, you know, here's the town and here's the school. Well, no, Knox was, you know, the courthouse was sort of between the women's dorm and the rest of the campus. It was a very small campus with the streets kind of running through it. But within the first week, I knew I was in the right place. I met kids from all over. Most of them were from Illinois. But it was just such an interesting bunch of people, and my mind immediately was challenged. So that was, you know, educationally, I have always been a proponent of a liberal arts education, and the small school was the right place for me, particularly because of my sheltered life. I had never gone to a movie, I'd never gone to a dance, you know, those kinds of things like smoking and drinking and wearing lipstick were forbidden kinds of things in the background. I might say my parents were Pentecostal ministers, and so I had a very strict kind of an upbringing. Not stifling, but it was, you know, you knew what you shouldn't do. So I remember one of the most amazing experiences of my life was sitting in a bull session in the dorm as a freshman and getting in an argument with somebody and saying, well, you know, the Bible is God's true word. And he said, well, how do you know? Well, it says so in the Bible. And there was this long pause, and he said, well, so the Bible says that, but what other proof do you have, you know? That sort of started me, challenged me, frankly, at the age, I was only 17 years old, see, because that's why that skipping the grade thing, I was 17 and most of the other people were 18 and 19, really old geezers by that time. So it was a wonderful school for me to go to. I finally decided to major in history, and I was one of those people who was really sad when college was over. I did not look forward to the end of it. I knew that it was a precious experience that would never, you know, be replicated. So I was, and of course I had the idea that I would go to graduate school because I had decided, I thought maybe when I went to school, I thought maybe I'd like to be a teacher. In the first month I said, well, if I'm going to teach, I'm going to teach in a place like this. I don't want to do high school stuff, you know, all those problems. And I had the same idea because my experience was, well, you go in and, you know, someone's going to pay my way. Well, in 1959, there weren't a lot of paying your own way, paying your way for you kinds of things.
Did you hit the mother load?
I applied to the University of Chicago and to the University of Wisconsin because that's where I was from, and I knew I would get in-state tuition, and Ohio State, and that was because my idol Professor John L. Stipp, the historian, was a graduate of Ohio State.
Is that with two P's?
Two P's, S-T-I-P-P, John L. Stipp.
I remember you talking about it.
And so I applied at Ohio State, and I was accepted at all three of them. And I got no money. You know, they said, come on and get a master's degree, start down the road. And Wisconsin offered that they would waive out-of-state tuition, but they didn't need to do that. So then I decided, well, I guess I can't afford to do this. So I began to look at alternatives, and I interviewed with a number of companies. One of which was R. Donnelly and Sons printing company in Chicago, and I had a very good interview, and they liked me a lot. And said, well, you know, I think we have a place for you. We're not hiring right now, but we expect, you know, later this fall there will be some. So I went home thinking that's what I would do. But I had the same kind of experience that I did in high school, this Deus Ex Machina kind of thing, where I went in to see John L. Stipp and tell him, you know, I haven't gotten anything. I've been admitted to all of these places. And he said, well, here, what about this? And he handed me this brochure that he'd just gotten from the University of Denver. And I said, well, I know where that is. It must be in Denver, but I don't know anything about it. And it was the announcement of the NDEA program. So I was in the, you know, it had just been created that spring, enacted into law. And so they were desperate to get people to come out there. And this was a full ride for 3 years plus a stipend. And the stipend which I think was $2,000 the first year. Well, that was more money than I'd ever seen in one place in my life. $2,000 stipend and $2,200 the next and $2,400 the next.
Tax-free.
Yeah, and I agonized over that and called John Stipp, and I called Dean Herman Mueller, who was one of the grand old men of Knox College history, who was the historian, and I talked with him about it, and I thought about it, and I said, well, I think it's a free PhD. I'm just a fool if I don't take it. So I went. So I'd never been to Denver, and I'd never been there either. It was the same thing, and my mother drove me out again. So here's deja vu all over again. Only this time it involved driving through places like Nebraska,
Right.
you know, and eastern Colorado, God-forsaken places where you pull into the gas station and you hear this noise. You get out to put in some gas. It's late at night. You hear this noise from the truck, and I look over. I'm looking right in the eyes of about 20 pigs staring at me out of the back. Hogs, I guess you would call them.
Right.
It was a new world. So I went there. Again, the same reason. I got paid to do it. So it was not that I did great research and said, this is the program for me. Got there, and there were 5 other people like myself, and it was, I think, a real exciting time. It was all a new thing for them. There was, as you know, some great professors there who were a combination of the old and some new young Turks that they hired to get there. And so I think it was a very good mentoring situation. And I got through with all of my coursework and my exams and everything because I didn't have to work. I got through in 3 years. Classic ABD after 3 years. I had, you know, romantically, I had gone through a variety of things as you would, and as fate would have it, in my last year there, I had, the summer before, got engaged to my old college sweetheart, who'd been a freshman in college when I was a senior. So she was graduating. This is in 1962. She was graduating. I was finishing up. We wanted to get married, and my father-in-law said, well, you know, come back when you've got a job. So I had done the whole thing, particularly the American Historical Associations, between the holidays convention meat market, where I was in Washington, D.C., and I can remember running from appointments in one hotel, appointments in the other one, and I had a lot of appointments. And out of that came an offer from Penn State University. The chair, Robert K. Murray, was there, and you know, a guy who I'd heard of before, and it was kind of interesting to talk to him. And very late in the spring, almost when I was despairing, I had turned down a job to go a state teachers college in Texas, Tarleton State, which, you know, offered me more money actually than I settled for, but I had no desire to live in a place I never heard of in Texas. So I got the job at Penn State and was married then in that summer, and so a month after being married we moved to State College, PA. I was what we would now call a contract faculty. Then I think my title was full-time temporary instructor, which you try to put that into your university document. A full-time temporary instructor teaching U.S. history surveys, and those were still the times in 1962 when U.S. history was a requirement for everybody in a state university. So they needed a lot of teachers, and the bulge was beginning, not yet, but we were starting. The university was probably about 18,000 to 20,000 then, and starting to grow some. So they had a need for people, and their solution to the mass problem was not to have huge lecture halls, but to have closed circuit television. So I went to the building. I can still even remember the name of it, and there was the very first class I ever taught as a full-time professor was an 8 o'clock class in the morning, and it was on closed circuit television with 2 other faculty members. One of them, we were all, by the way, full-time temporary instructors. One of them got a tenure track, which was unusual. When we were hired, we were told this is a 2-year get out of here kind of thing, no chance for any, you know. Right. You come here, we'll give you a nice experience, and then you get out of here and go somewhere else. And so I taught in a primitive studio, black and white, with a small monitor in 10 to 12 different rooms, and lectured for 50 minutes, and then tried to leave time for 15. It was actually an hour and 15-minute class period. So I taught U.S. survey, both up. I think at that time we went up through Reconstruction, and then the second one was after Reconstruction. And I taught both of those, and then I also taught, you know, what we called live sections, which meant there were people in the room instead of technicians who would say, "What's the matter?" You know, it was very distracting. Some of the camera would go out. I don't know what's the matter with it, Bill. You know, and they're 3 feet away from you talking. But I kind of flourished in that environment, and I think I was probably the most effective TV teacher in the department. So at that point, in my second year, the chair was still Robert K. Murray. He asked if I wanted to stay for another year, and I said, yeah, because we really loved it. State College was fun. It's so long ago that Joe Paterno was just a quarterback school. And now he's, what, 104 years old?
Yeah, right.
But it was, you know, it was hard to get to. The interstate hadn't been opened as of yet, and so it really was Happy Valley, where you, particularly in the winter, once you got there, you were kind of there. Yeah. But it was a nice a nice group of people. Once again, there were a mixture of old-timers and young Turks like myself, and I thought it was a very, you know, stimulating time. I had more good discussions. I remember particularly when I was in my shoes, Herb Erskowitz, he left there to go to Temple and stayed at Temple forever and published prolifically, and I just saw him about a year and a half ago. Great guy. We had the best discussions. And Ari Hogenboom, who later went to Brooklyn College and is now retired, he became a mentor to me. He was sort of like the big brother I never had at that point, and he took me under his wing a lot. So it was really a wonderful experience. I just taught survey courses, and I really, frankly, during the 3 years there, I got going on my dissertation, because even though I told all the recruiters, yeah, I'll be done with my dissertation, boy, did we all lie, didn't we? I'll be done in another, 6 months. I really had to do most of the work after I left, and so I worked there and went back. We spent the first summer back in Denver working on doing research. Those were the days when in history you kind of could only do your research in one place, you know.
Right.
You couldn't do it on the net.
Yeah, right.
Boy, that's a change for the better, that's for sure. So I still wasn't done, and my third year was up. And we hated to leave that place too, because it was really, we had a lot of really dear friends that we kept track of. And it was just a good intellectual and social environment as well. I began at that point kind of to cultivate a sort of an area, and that was urban history, because my dissertation was about the progressive era in Denver and progressive reform in the early part of the 20th century. And so when I went out on the market then, which I had to do again, went to the American Historical Association, I began to see there were an occasional opening for urban history. Well, I'd never heard of it. I must say, though, that when I took Western history from Harold Dunham, I almost said Dr. Dunham. Yeah, from Harold Dunham, that the semester that he taught that when I was in there, he emphasized urban history of the West. And he read Richard Wade's book about the urban frontier, and so I was not totally unfamiliar with that. I sold myself as an urban historian, and the people who picked up the tab then for me then was Memphis State University. Again, did I have a plan to go to Memphis State? Absolutely not. I was sort of scared, actually, going down there, because this was now 1965, and we'd seen lots of movies of what was happening in the South during the early 60s. You know, when you heard of places like Memphis, Tennessee, and Mississippi, and as William Faulkner said, the state of Mississippi begins in the lobby of the Peabody Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. You know, it was kind of scary stuff, and I'd never been south of the Ohio River, except when I flew to Washington, D.C. to the historical conference. So that's where we went next, and this time it was a tenure track position, but because I didn't have my dissertation finished yet, I was hired as an instructor. And when I got down there, you know, I had considerable trepidation. It was certainly a cultural shock to go there. You haven't lived till you've sat in a football stadium with 55,000 people, and about 50,000 of them are Ole Miss fans, and they're all doing a rebel yell as they come out. But I wouldn't change that for anything. It was a great. We were there for 2 years. I taught urban history for the first time there, for my first time ever, as well as the standard grind run U.S. survey courses. That was where I found myself one semester teaching 3 straight U.S. since Reconstruction, or since the Civil War kind of courses in the same room, so that it was really hard to figure out whether I'd said that before or not. You ever have that feeling?
I did.
Yeah, I think I just said that before, but no, it'd been at 10 o'clock, and now it was 1 o'clock. But that was also a good experience. There were a lot of good people there, and I guess one of the things that I learned then, you know, you snobs, there are good people everywhere, and there are interesting people everywhere. So I had some really good colleagues, and we had an active social life, young couples and all of that. We had our first child there, so you know, that was a new chapter in our lives. But maybe because I had never, I started my first job knowing that it was temporary. I never went to any job thinking I was going to be there for the rest of my life. Except maybe I did, the next job. I'll take that back. The next job, after 2 years, in my second year there, I was contacted by a guy. Again, talk about not planning any things. In one of my trips to Denver to do research, I had been working in the Denver Public Library in their archives, and every day for a couple of weeks, I think, I'd seen this guy there. And after the last day, kind of, I went up to him and said, you know, I see you working here all the time. You know, I introduced myself. Well, it was Ron Davis. who was a social historian at Southern Methodist University. And so we had a little chat. Well, then I got on the train, which is what we did then. Get on the train in the evening, ride all night, and get off in Chicago the next morning. And I'm sitting in the train, and along comes Ron Davis walking up. He said, I changed my mind. I decided I was going to go back by train instead of my airplane, so I canceled the flight. He was at Michigan State at the time. So we sat in a club car and yacked it up and laughed and, had a few drinks and spent a good part of the night on it. End of, I thought, I'll never see him again. But he is the one who called at Memphis State when I was there. This had happened before while I was still at Penn State. And we bumped into each other. So anyway, he called, and the next thing I knew, I made a visit. Those were the old days, the old boy network with no affirmative action office and no other kind of things and no ideas about any other sort of stuff. Who do you know? Send somebody. And I went out there, and I thought, this is the kind of school I'd really like to be in for a long time. It's a good private school with strong liberal arts undergraduate education. It's in the middle of an exciting city.
With a big endowment.
Well, it didn't at the time. Actually, at the time, it was not a rich school, but there were a lot of rich kids going there. I can tell you. Yes. So I went there then after 2 years. That was in '67, with the idea probably that I would stay there because this just had a lot of stuff going.
Yeah.
So while we were there, we had our second child, and before the year was out, or after being there about a year, and bought our first house, and kind of decided we were going to enter the kind of staid, settle down sort of people. I taught urban history there, and I introduced a course there in 1968 called Black History. Never been taught before. Now, I might say that at SMU at that time, with probably about 5,500 undergraduates and maybe 1,500 graduates, there were 30 African-American students there, one of whom was Calvin Hill, quarterback, or the running back for the Dallas Cowboys, who was in the School of Theology there, Perkins School of Theology. So it was the heart of the white ghetto, and I was doing what Stokely Carmichael advice was, as I become more concerned about issues of race, being a northern white kid growing up, never having had an African American in any class I had until I got into graduate school, and maybe I had one. I was ignorant of the subject, frankly, and as a historian, all of growing up, I really did not have any grounding in any kind of African Americanism. But Stokely Carmichael said, well, you want to help out? Tell your mama and papa they're racists, and so I had all white classes, and I tried to point out that there was a whole group of people sort of neglected by history. I taught that 3 different occasions while I was there. And while I was doing that, I thought, I got interested. That was 1967, the summer before we went there. 67, for the record, is when the riots occurred in Detroit, Michigan, and in Newark, New Jersey, and a lot of other places. And there was a tremendous amount of unrest and other kinds of things going on. So I thought I would do something with all the research I was having to do to teach this course I knew nothing about. The typical thing, you got to stay at least a week ahead of the students. And so I started compiling stuff about interracial violence, and that ended up through Ari Hogenboom, my friend from Penn State, in my publishing the first thing I did, which was Race Riots in Black and White, published by Prentice Hall. It was a weird reader that didn't go chronologically, but went by themes.
Copy of which is just around the corner here.
Yes,
In the bookcase.
and I might add that one of the great pieces of personal pleasure I had was back in the early '70s when I was here. John Barber used that book, Race Riots in Black and White, for years. I'm sure he was probably the only place using it in any quantities, but he taught this big class, and he used that book, and I was walking through the student center, and here's this kid sitting there reading a copy of my book. So I said, how do you like it? He said, this is a great book. I'm not lying here. No, I'm not lying. He said, this is a great book. It's really interesting. I like, and I said, oh, that's nice. I wrote it. He said, whoa, wow. So he said, could you sign it for me? So that was my first autograph that I ever gave to anybody. And I thought, without my saying, hey, I wrote that, what do you think about it? I just said, what do you like? It's really good. Kid raving about a college textbook. So I started that when I was at SMU. There was a lot of turnover in that department. About 4 or 5 people had left before I came, which is why I got hired. And several people were leaving, and my third year there, out of 16 people, there were 5 actively looking for employment also. And I was one of the 5. So what I thought was going to be a long-term thing was not working out too well for me. We loved Dallas. I liked my colleagues. I mean, it was a wonderful situation. But the department chair was a very prickly person and very difficult to get along with. And I think I had one day where everything went so well. Class went great. I got a letter from Prentice Hall saying he'd like, part of the manuscript. All these wonderful things happened. And then as I was leaving, I saw the department chair. And I went home mad. So from being this great day, I said, life is too short for me to let somebody do this. And so I got actively looking. And a guy named Warren Vander Hill had been contacting me before and saying, hey, we got just a place for you. Why don't you come to Ball State? No, I don't want to live in Muncie, Indiana. But moving from Dallas to Muncie, I don't think so. But another thing happened at that time, and that was in December of my third year there. My father died very suddenly. He had a heart attack, and boom, was gone. And I began to realize, we were far from our roots, that is, I'm a Midwesterner. Right. And so I was in an emotional state where the idea of leaving what we had there and coming back to this part of the country was in my mind. So, coupled with what else was going on, the offer came, and I accepted. So I didn't aspire to Ball State. I didn't aspire. But here's another one. Undergraduate, graduate school. My life is just a series of just accidents where something happens at the right time. I guess there would be some people who say there's divine providence at work, or kismet, or what have you. But it's been a kind of an unplanned, randomized life. That I was going to say. I also had another one of those why did I go there things, because when I came, it was a long time for the contract to get settled for some reason. It was lying on some dean's desk somewhere for a long time, and I didn't tell anybody that I was thinking about going. I tried to keep it under my hat, and our house, we put our house up, didn't want to do any of that stuff until I had a contract. And so that dragged out longer than it usually would have. And wouldn't you know, the week, almost a week after I had signed the contract and sent it back, the department chair got deposed by the provost. And it was one of those we knew. I said, he's the kind of a guy, if he ever steps on a banana peel, his body will be riddled with stab wounds before he hits the ground. And that's exactly what happened. And I thought, if this had happened 2 weeks ago, maybe I wouldn't have signed that contract. And I probably wouldn't have. But I'm glad I did, because it turns out that it wasn't just him, it's SMU. So they've done a lot of stuff that just surprises you, and I think the place remained in turmoil after I left. But
So
I
that's-
might not have come here if you know, if that contract had been 2 weeks later, I might have stayed down. And then our lives would be different, of course. But so that's how I got here. And at the time that I came here, had gone from being this generally trained historian to being somebody who had developed an area in urban history and in black history.
So,
That's a long way.
Back to my questions. Well, yeah, I probably could have done about 70% of that based on our relationship, but it is a really interesting tale
So,
because
yeah.
unlike a lot of the people I've interviewed for this study, you have been to different places. And what I've found with a number of our colleagues, the people I refer to as in our age cohort, who are part of our study, that it's very, very unusual to have people who were at 3 different institutions before they came to Ball State. That you might find somebody who had been at 1. I can't recall anybody who had been at 2 unless they were in a different professional life and then made the transition over to academia. But let me get back then to my questions, as I said. When you came here then, what were your expectations, even though you've been on 3 different faculties, of the role of a faculty member at Ball State University?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let me even begin that by one quick line. One of my expectations was, given my track record, that I would be here for a couple of years or 3. I didn't necessarily look at this like, you know, I'd be this age still.
Right. No one does.
Right. And
at least not for, no, I haven't found anybody yet that said I came here and by gosh,
Yeah.
the day I got here, I planned to retire from Ball State.
Yeah, no, I thought, well, we'll give this a shot for a little while and see what goes on.
Yeah.
What were my expectations as a faculty member? I'm not sure that I had any expectations that were not internal.
Okay.
I don't think I sensed any great external expectations. But I knew that I would try to do the best that I could and that I would try to do some research on my own, because I had.
Right.
I mean, when I came here, that Race Riots in Black and White was in publication. It arrived on the stands, I think, probably
Right.
the first year. It had a 1970 copyright. And I had done a couple of articles, nothing big, but I really liked that. I didn't have a feeling that I needed to do that to succeed here, but I had a feeling that I needed to do that to be good at what I was doing.
Okay.
And I liked it.
Well, you've been around people at 3 institutions that did that.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike a lot of your new but older colleagues that you met when you came to Ball State and got to know, who were never part of that kind of culture.
Right. I didn't sense much of that culture at Memphis State among the older people, or even at SMU among the older people. But the younger people seemed to, because people who were at both of those schools went on to publish stuff, and you know, they were maintaining an active research life.
I guess the point I'm trying to make is that someone like you came here already seeing himself as a teacher scholar, which later became the model for the Ball State faculty, at least if they were people who hoped to get tenure and get promoted to the senior ranks. But that didn't really become part of the Ball State culture until the mid-1980s and after.
Yeah. You know, I was just going over that with somebody, in fact, at lunch today. I had 2 distinct impressions. First, before I came here, I can still remember sitting with Dean Bob Carmen and History Department Chair Everett Farrell in the Dean's office trying to determine what my beginning salary was going to be.
On the famous grid!
The famous grid, what we now call a spreadsheet. And you knew you wanted to be as far down and to the right as you could be, because once you got here, it's like any other place. I mean, when you're being recruited, you know that's the only time anyone's wallet is open. I knew that when I went to SMU, you know. And so, but that was based strictly on years of seniority and on degree.
Yeah.
That was it. There
Yeah.
was no other parameter.
Right.
It was, how many years have you been doing this,
Yeah.
and what's your degree, and then what's your rank.
Yeah.
So those were the three things.
Carmen would put a little pencil.
Once he drew that circle, there's where
You
you
were
started
there
salary.
forever, yeah.
And then you were going to get increments.
Yeah.
From my experience at SMU, by the way, I was not as upset by the salary schedule as a lot of other people were, because I had seen what bickering over, at that time, $300
Right.
a year. Hey, you're making well, 10,400, and I'm making 10,100.
Yeah.
And people would get all out of joint about that, and they were always trying, what are you getting, and all of this kind of stuff. And so I found it really a very freeing kind of a thing. Hey, you're not going to worry about it. I'm going to get my raise,
Yeah,
whatever I
sure.
do, and I know what I'm going to do.
Right.
But if you didn't compare yourself to someone else, but then there were people, of course, who shall remain unnamed, who always compared themselves with someone else
Yeah.
who was making $400 more than they were and not doing anything in the way of scholarly work,
Yeah.
and yet they were being,
And they
and they were
friendly teachers besides.
yeah. So you have, it was a protection for Deadwood, but I found it a freeing thing for someone who didn't have to worry about, hey, I know what I'm going to get. So that was that even before I came here, it was an odd kind of thing, but I found it better than the system we had, which was the chairman arbitrarily decides who's going to get what, and that stunk. Talk about a bad system. You've got an autocratic chairman who decides what your pay is going to be next year. You like that, or a salary schedule? But also, I had a very strong impression, maybe because I knew you ahead of time, but it didn't take long for it to sink in that probably getting tenure was not going to be a tough thing.
Right.
And I think people around the coffee room say, well, you can hear several of them saying it, unless you have, unless you have sex with the president's wife on the steps of the administration building, you're going to get tenure, kind of thing.
It was put to me, unless you were an axe murderer, you're
Yeah,
probably gonna get
something.
tenure.
You had to do something really
Yeah.
heinous, and so tenure seemed not to be an issue. And it was 5 years.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, Cook changed it to 7.
Yeah. So I remember when I was up for tenure. People elsewhere, congratulations. Oh, you got tenure. And I'm thinking, big deal.
Yeah, right.
It didn't mean anything. I didn't get any more money. It was no.
That's
and
right.
it was no real gate that I
Yeah.
felt, well, hey, I've gone through this gate. You had to be. You had to keep your nose clean, essentially, and
Be a good colleague.
yeah, be a good colleague. And I managed to do that.
But
So-
let me go back to the point about when you came here, you really didn't think that you were going to stay. I guess, as I've asked everybody to study, well, then why did you stay?
I've often asked myself that question, especially when I was younger. At this point in our lives, we look back and you think, what if, once in a
Right.
while. But I think I've had some wonderful opportunities here. I've been able to do things that I never thought that I would. I spent 8 days in Nepal.
Right.
Talk about something a little exotic. I stayed here. This is a funny thing. It has nothing to do with the university, but I think that our choice of residence was a huge factor. Not much bigger than we knew at the time.
You mean to live in the country?
Yeah. When we moved here, as you know, you found us a place just
Sure,
down
yeah.
the street from you in this
Yeah.
little tiny 3-bedroom, 1-bath, no shower house, and it was a big come down for us. We
Yeah.
had a really nice house. It was modest
Mhm.
size, but it was a very nice house in Dallas, and we shrunk down in size and amenities. It had no air conditioning, and, a number of things we were accustomed to. So we went on the prowl immediately,
Right.
even though we signed a year's lease. And the summer was hot, sticky, all of that. So by October, we found this house, and it was in the country. It was 2 acres, and I couldn't believe I could afford this house. it was just an incredible thing. And I really never thought, long-term, what a difference that would make in our lives, some good, some bad. But we were only 5.5 miles from the camp.
Only 5.5 miles?
Yes, which in Muncie is, we might as well live on the outskirts of Dayton.
Yeah,
you know.
that's right.
I mean, on the southeast side of town, on the southeast side of town, my journey to work every day is taking me right through the very heart of Muncie, right through downtown, to get here. But it takes me 20 minutes from the time I shut my door at my house to the time I sat at my desk here, 20 minutes. Now, 90% of the world would kill for a commute like that.
That's true, it's true.
And in Muncie somehow, So we didn't live in the faculty ghetto.
No.
We're not surrounded.
You were the Department of Country Squire.
Yeah, we were not surrounded by colleagues, and to some degree I miss that, I miss that. We don't have strong relationships with any of our neighbors, partly because the closest ones are a block away.
Continue.
Okay, so that has meant that we were less a part of the university culture in many ways. And it meant that a lot of my energies were devoted simply to work, physical labor. And oddly enough, as we've gotten older, instead of cutting back, we've gone from 2 acres now to 9 acres, and I have far more to take care of. But I always thought when I moved there, this would be a great place to retire to. I'm thinking, but I'm only 32 or something, however old I was. Why would I, I wasn't thinking about it. So this is, and I, with kids and everything, when I got home, so many nights it was like I'd gotten to a resort. It just felt like I've never had to escape to the country. I want to escape to the city. So next week we go live right in the heart of Baltimore with our kids. But it's that was probably a strong factor. But I never got itchy again.
Okay.
I never got itchy. I think the history department, when I came here, as you know, there were just a wonderful bunch of people there. And not since I had been an undergraduate did I feel so much a part of a strong community as I did there. I mean, I had felt it elsewhere, but gosh, that house on South Talley Street, the annex with Tony Edmonds and John Barber and myself, and you were there, and then we had John Kumalides, who didn't quite fit that stamp, Dave Cammons.
Right.
It was just a rollicking place.
It was pretty unusual.
We had intellectual discussions, we had pedagogical discussions, we had arguments about music, we had everything there. And so that was just a wonderful experience.
Well, I guess at some point I've got to get this transition in here, and I suppose this is as good a point as any, and that is that you are unique in the history of Ball State University, because during the 4 years that Jim Cook was Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, he had a great deal to do with changing your life. And I mean that more from an academic standpoint, because of course you were part of a very atypical for Ball State faculty development project, which ultimately got you from the history department, though you maintained academic rank there, but over to the College of Architecture and Planning to become a member of the planning faculty. So given the atypicality of that, I think it's important for the historical record that those who want to search and look at this years from now will know why that happened and how it happened.
Well, that came as kind of the capstone and the final push in what was a career change, a field change. I'm one of those people who taught classes. Almost all of the classes I've taught, I had nothing more than the basic foundation for. I did not have specialty courses. So I taught urban history, which I had to make up for myself, black history, which I had to make up for myself. And then because I was doing urban history, I got involved with the Urban and Regional Studies Institute, which was not really an institute, it was an undergraduate interdisciplinary major. It had no other research function or anything else. It was in the College of Sciences and Humanities, and it involved, it was an outgrowth of the late 60s of geography, economics, political science, history, and sociology, combining some forces to create an interdisciplinary major, originally called Regional and Urban Planning, but eventually changed to Urban and Regional Studies because the planning franchise was in the College of Architecture and Planning. And in 1973, my predecessor, well, Frank McGee, who was in the political science department, left, took a one-year appointment back in New England, and I was the interim director of that. It was a half-time load, and so I physically moved my office over to another one of those little houses on the south side of campus, and directed that program. Frank didn't come back, and I was appointed then to do that. I continued to teach history classes while I was doing that, and I taught some urban studies classes. So I was sort of drifting in the direction of planning, because an awful lot of the students who came into that program, and it was a small program, I shouldn't say there were thousands, but in that small program, a good number of those students were contemplating careers in planning. There was no undergraduate program in that direction. And so then my office moved another, spatial type of, that's S-P-A-T-I-A-L, spatial, it was space. My office was moved when they tore the house down. That's significant. Two of the offices I've occupied were in houses that were demolished.
For a planner.
And so I moved into North Quad at the time when the planning department was just down the hall from me. So I got to know the people as they started ramping up the graduate program in planning. I got to know them, and we went out to lunch together all the time, and that became my new focus, actually. I began to drift away from the history department as such and get involved more with planning. In 1978-79 academic year, I was awarded a Lilly Endowment Faculty Development grant, and I think I was maybe in the third or fourth class of those to do that. That was just a marvelous program. What a marvelous program. They just wanted you to go out and do something not related to your line of work, but to develop, to grow. It was a faculty development, a growth thing. Something related but different, and it didn't have to have a product. So I seized on that because, as I said in my application, every fall since I was 5 years old, I've been in school. I never had a year off. I don't think you did either. Maybe you did in your undergraduate career. Did you take a year off? I never had.
Playing basketball, you can't take a year off.
Well, anyway, I decided, no, I just need to get away from school. I've been here. Well, that was 40 years by that time. So they funded this proposal, and they raved about it. They said, this is exactly the kind of thing we wanted to, perfect. I went out to Seattle, and I worked as a freebie on the staff of the city councilman, Michael Hilt, who was in charge of their planning, zoning, and housing issues. There were 9 city councilmen elected at large. It's a strong council system. So this was where all of the planning stuff had to come through the government, the final approval. And I worked some in a neighborhood planning office, but I soon found that I couldn't work in the two places. I didn't have any credibility in the planning office because I was now working in the policy area. And that was marvelous. I discovered a real passion for housing and housing programs in that. Came back and began even teaching a class in housing for the planning department. And so our lives got more entwined with planning. And then when Cook became the provost, he said essentially, well, this is stupid to have an undergraduate planning program masquerading as something else in the College of Sciences and Humanities, and a graduate planning program not masking itself, but small, in the College of Architecture and Planning. He said, I'm going to put the undergraduate program in the College of Architecture and Planning, much to the dismay of a good many of the faculty there who treated these people as, you know, second-class citizens who hadn't been through their own separate admissions policy or process. But he said, I'm going to move that there, and you can take your choice. Either go with the program into that college or go back to history. And if you go into that program, you know, what do you need? Well, I really negotiated probably most with Bob Fisher at that point, who was the interim dean.
Right.
And the deal was that I just said, you know, if I'm going to become a planning educator, I think I really need to have some planning education. Right. I don't have the internal credibility to myself without that. And so, my first year in that college, I got bought out. I was paid my salary, and the university paid for my tuition.
Good go you for.
Yeah, they paid my tuition, and I studied several. That was the most deliberate choice I made in education, because I thought, whoa, this is what a wonderful opportunity this is. I don't want to blow this one. And through my planning friends here, we settled on Rutgers as a place that would be the right place for me to go. There were some people there that whose work I was familiar with, and who I thought that would be the right place. So I approached them, and there was no skin off their nose. They said, "Sure, come on here." So I became a full-time student. Now the catch for me personally, there was a real high price to be paid for that, because unlike when I spent the year sabbatical in Seattle, my family said, no, we're not going to go to New Jersey. We're not moving to New Jersey. Well, the kids were, you know, Melinda, our oldest daughter, was in 7th grade in Seattle, and now she was in high school, and she wasn't about to do that. So I left my family for a year while I did that. So it wasn't a freebie.
Right.
It was a very high cost.
Yeah,
To be, but, and we didn't even have cheap telephone rates in those years either. So that was the price I paid, and I stayed with some very good friends from my childhood that lived just outside of New Brunswick, and that was a very rich experience as well. So I became a boarder at the age of whatever it was, 19.
Yeah.
And went to school. And I took 5 courses each semester, and managed to stack up 30 hours, which is enough to get an MS, which is a Master of Science in Policy Planning. I can't even remember all of the words in it anymore, because I thought I might as well get that. I studied with some really good people. I had some wonderful classes. I worked my tail off. I can tell. I mean, isn't it?
That's hard.
You had to get all A's.
Yeah.
I mean, how can I come back? Here you are, a full professor going to school, and you're not going to come back with a B. I did get 1 B+ in one class, but I really that was the capstone in my feeling of confidence to say, okay, I think I can do this. I can do this stuff, because it's. So I continued to develop, and out of that experience, I also, one of the people I worked with, Jim Hughes, who was well established in the field of housing and other stuff, and is now, by the way, the dean of the now I'm spacing on the name of the college. It's named after somebody. The college in which planning and other things are.
At Rutgers?
At Rutgers, yeah. He's now the dean there. Anyway, he said, yeah, why don't you put together the stuff? We really need to have a reader in housing policy. And so I did that, put that together, and that's actually the best thing I did, probably. Anecdotes all over. It's called Federal Housing Policy and Programs.
One of those lofty titles.
Published by Rutgers University Press in the the Center for Urban Policy Research. So it's a prestigious label on it, and I did that. I finished it up. I began it while I was there, and I finished it up in about a couple of years after I came back here. And that's been very well received. It's out of print now.
So after that, you came back and began your illustrious career as Warren member of the planning faculty.
That's right.
Let me switch to the topic of institutional change. You gave your observations. Ways that Ball State changed during your career here, and perhaps some ways in which it remained the same.
Well, of course, for me, I've got a different benchmark because I'm not in the history department. You know, if I were still had retired in the history department, I would have a benchmark that would go back.
Right.
But by the time I got into the College of Architecture and Planning and into the planning department, you know, the rules were already changing. You know, and some of those cultural expectations, institutional expectations, I think have probably changed. I think that I think the emphasis on research and publication is far, you know, just way beyond what it was when I came here. I think the institution has expectations, and I think almost all promotion and tenure documents probably now reflect that. I know ours, planning does. I don't think we didn't have any really strong rules about it beforehand. The College of Architecture and Planning has remained a place that has put a premium on being a good teacher. And I suspect that the rest of the university has as well. And so, now how you define that, that's the age-old problem. How do you say that? How do you determine that? But I think if someone has a reputation for being a poor teacher in that college, they're probably not going to last very long. There may be some exceptions to that. Okay. I think that an awful lot of the change may not have, there were some things that had to happen institutionally, like abolishing the salary scale.
Right.
That had to be an institutional decision. Pressure to spiff up, tighten up tenure requirements and promotion requirements. The separation of promotion from salary increases. In the old days, the only way to get a hefty salary increase, you got to get promoted. I remember one of our colleagues going down and buying a new car right after getting promoted to the next level. Whoa, now I can afford to do that. Well, now the two are theoretically divorced. Right. They probably aren't in reality. Yeah. But it's not that automatic. Yeah. But we got to promote old Joe here because he's got another kid, needs the money.
Needs a car.
Yeah. But I think while those institutional things had to happen, I think that the pressures for them to happen probably came from both outside and within. Outside in that what it means to be a university in the 1990s and on is where we have to be headed if we're going to be a university in the United States.
Do you think that happened during the time you were
I
involved?
think that happened. And I think also the people coming in, the younger faculty, not just younger faculty, but I think nobody came out of graduate school in the 80s, 70s and 80s and 90s thinking that they could be like they were in the 50s and 60s. I don't think anybody thought that. I didn't think that myself. Right. And then when I got here, I thought, oh no, you just don't insult anybody and you'll do okay. I just think that the graduate experience, whatever field you are in now, the graduate experience puts you through a process that says you will be a researcher and you will disseminate the results of your research. That's what it means to be a graduate student.
Okay. So you view the changes that occurred at Ball State as positive?
Yes.
Okay. Any that you see that might be deemed negative?
Well, yeah, the changes that are the negative ones are just the changes that have been generic to universities. I mean, there's just been so much more administrative junk.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah, I'm
I
not
mean,
gonna disagree.
you've been in the big
Yeah.
house where that happens. Well, it's no different for everybody down at the level. The department, this used to be called the department secretary, who's now the office
Right.
administrator.
Right.
Those people's jobs are unconscionable. They have to know, they have to do, the work has been shoved back to them while people somewhere else are doing something else. So the sheer volume of paperwork and meetings and other kinds of things, I mean, who could like that?
Okay.
other than the purveyors of computers and paper. So that's not a good thing, in my opinion. But I think the amount of work involved is significantly greater in recruiting, but I think that that's a positive change. I mean, having been the recipient of the network, there was something flawed about that fundamentally, and that's why we had the kind of demographic profile that we've had. So I think that the need to be more intentional about diversifying, I think that's very positive. Not easy to do.
You mentioned some people during your undergraduate career, and also some while you were teaching before you came to Ball State that had what I call a special impact on you. Were there any people during your long and distinguished career at Ball State who had any kind of important impact on you?
Well, yeah. I don't know that any of them were like old guard, because when you're 32 and in your fourth job, you sort of feel like you know more than you did. you know less than the amount of stuff you don't know has grown enormously, but you do have a little more confidence in what you can do. I would say that probably some of the people in the history department had a lasting impact on me. John Barber, Tony Edmonds, John Weekland, Ray
White.
Yeah, Ray. I was thinking besides that, Ray White. Probably less so because I wasn't that directly involved in his teaching side, but and probably Dwight in different ways. Those are people who had, I think, an impact on me as far as teaching, as far as hard work. Your impact on me was less than I had thought it would be, because you got off into doing all this other stuff, and we scattered, the way universities do. But
Okay.
There are some others.
I want to switch to. Well, I'm going to go in two directions. Let me start with areas of special involvement in the university, and here I'm really looking more for areas that might be categorized as the service component of one's long career. Were there particular areas within the university, because I'll get to without the university in the next part of the question, but within the university that were important in your life? I know you didn't spend every waking hour in the university setting, but were there any others within the institution that might have been important to you?
Well, I think being on a number of dean searches is important.
Yeah.
And
You learn a lot about yourself and others.
you learn a
on these
lot.
searches.
You learn a lot. Yeah, yeah. And I've been both privileged and frustrated, I guess. I've been a part of several failed dean searches.
Yeah.
Those are crushing.
I think you learn more from the failed ones than you do
Oh,
from the
yeah.
successful.
They're crushing though. You know,
They're
think-
crushing to a provost, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, well, they're crushing in a couple of ways. One is that, you know, just the simple fact that you put so much time and effort into something and nothing happened. It's like you planted the whole garden and just as it came up, you know, the weasels all got in and rabbits and ate everything. There's nothing there because you've got nothing left. But they're also crushing in a way, potentially, to people because they may carry a message about that maybe you don't think what you're doing, what your college is doing, what this program is doing is as good as you think you are.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes the pool is shallow and thin.
Yeah, right.
And you think, well, you know, we're going to get all kinds of people for this. And then you discover that maybe not, maybe not. So I think that's...
Okay, that's a good one.
Yeah, that's a downer, I think.
Okay, we'll have service as a downer in this interview.
Well,
That's good.
no, but the exhilarating part is to be
Yeah.
able to go through a list of good candidates and be able to say, you know, this is there's a lot of winners in here, and then to be able to close the deal.
I wasn't going to add that there are a lot of winners in this pool, and we picked this one, but boy, when he got here, was he a loser?
Well, as we all know, any search has a...
How about areas of involvement in the community?
Well, that's been a very rich part of my life.
Yeah.
And I might say that I had a very jaundiced view of that before I got to be involved in the community.
Yeah.
You know, we used to joke about that. Well, so-and-so got promoted because, you know, he was active in the Boy Scouts and did all of this. And here I've got these 2 articles and I didn't get promoted kind of thing. Or someone would publish something and say, well, I guess maybe that'll equal one Kiwanis Club membership sort of thing. But that's been a very rich, you know, personal thing for me. 4 years after we moved here, we became involved in the Grace Episcopal Church, and that's been a defining institution for us for 30 years. After attending St. Mattress and All Sunday papers for about a decade and a half, we just jumped right into that, and that's just been a very rich experience for all of us, for Liz and myself, and for our family. And I've spent a lot of energy on that. Probably one of the most rewarding things that I've ever done. Actually, there was a move afoot that began in 1997 to consider moving the church. It's east of downtown. It's an old historic building. To move the church out in the suburbs, and I can say confidently that if I had not been on the governing board at Westwood, that probably would have happened. And we studied the issue, and then we decided we would stay, but we decided that we needed to do some serious work at the physical facility. So then I was asked to chair the committee on design and building and getting the thing going. That got done. Then I was asked to chair the capital campaign to raise it. There are a lot of good people in that parish, and I was very flattered and humbled to do those. And we had a smashingly successful capital campaign. So I would rate those as one of the best experiences. Very high on my list of contributions that I've made to make the world at least as good as I found it.
You've also been involved in Habitat?
I've been involved with Habitat now for probably 15 years, something like that, as a board member, and that's it's a very rewarding thing to me. Every third Monday, board meeting, and then I don't do nails and pound things.
Right.
I told them I'd be on the board if I didn't have to do that. And yet they found ways, there's a lot to make it work. And so I've been on a lot of committees that line up with that. I was on the board of directors of the neighborhood redevelopment corporation in the East Central neighborhood. I resigned that this past year after about 15, 16 years. I think I was able to help things happen there. But it was time for me to get out of that situation. And I was on the board of the Alpha Center, which was in the old parish hall.
Right.
It's not affiliated at all with Grace Church, and I happened to be on both boards, and the head of both boards at the time when we did a substantial remodeling for that. So,
And you sing. Gotta get
I love to sing.
I think Masterworks. I know you're long
Masterworks.
interest in music.
Masterworks is a wonderful thing to have. I mean, there are things here that, so maybe you live in Dallas or New York City or what have you, but what slice of the action do you have? And I was in Civic Theater, 3 productions back in the late 80s, which I was hoping I'd get back into.
Time is time.
Yeah.
Okay, a complete switch. What's your perspective on the role of the faculty at Ball State? Perhaps what the role of the faculty ought to be, if you don't think it is what it should be?
Okay, I guess sort of define role.
What I'm really after here is the place, role of faculty in governance, of faculty in decision-making. Maybe this is a question that comes from my 15 years as provost, I don't know, but I've asked everybody this question and I've gotten a variety of answers.
Okay, yeah, well that narrows it down, that focuses the question pretty much. What should the role be in governance?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I've learned in all of my years is that faculty really consider themselves to be self-employed.
Sure.
And when you're a department chair, you sure find that out.
To a fairly well.
Oh, yeah, it reminded there is an institutional signature there. It's not yours on your paycheck. I guess I would give the kind of an answer about render unto Caesar those things which are Caesar's, and unto God those things which are God. Now, I won't argue about who's Caesar, who's God here, but in the case of the faculty, there are some things that faculty need to control. I think they need to control academic affairs. I think faculties determine that because they're the ones who have to do it, and they're the ones who knows what's going on. Then I think there are some things that you have an administration to do. I don't think the faculty wants to be in charge of compliance. I don't think they want to be in charge of external fundraising. There's a whole lot of institutional development and maintenance activities that has to be the work of people who have that as a job description. So faculties need to be in charge, though, of the academic side of the university. Where do you draw that line? You've lived in the administration building long enough to know that that's a tough line to draw, because budget makes policy. Don't tell me what your policy is. Show me your budget. Okay. And so I think there should be a role for faculty in that. I mean, you can take any kind of example. If you consider your parking, and parking is a problem for everybody. I mean, that's a non-issue really. Because parking is always a problem, and most people think they have a God-given right to park no more than 50 steps from where their building is, you know, which is nonsense.
Yeah.
But is parking there to facilitate the mission of the university by in a lot of different ways, by allowing people to get there and so on, or is parking a revenue producing thing?
Okay.
I think that's a decision the faculty should be involved in,
Yeah.
and the students should be.
Well, the faculty should be involved in the discussion.
That's right.
Right.
They should be involved in that discussion, and
Yeah.
if, you know, and so you find that a dollars and cents decision is one that can have some impact
Okay.
on other areas. I just picked that out of there. But
Well, the reason I asked the question is that I have long felt that the faculty at Ball State would have been better served by having a faculty senate than by having their voice all mixed up with administrators and students in the system that we've had for low this many years, which we have called
Mhm.
a university senate.
Mhm.
And so I guess to some degree that's why I've asked people in our age cohort if they feel that might have been a better situation than what we have had during our entire
Mhm.
careers.
I don't know, because we don't know how it would, you know, we just don't have any experience with it.
Right.
But I think that having a faculty voice, which goodness knows would never be unified about anything,
Yeah.
but having an untrammeled faculty
Right.
voice would be
Good word.
a good
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
But there are limits. Now, interesting, when we were in Oxford 8 years ago, they were having a battle with this wealthy guy who wanted to donate
yeah.
this big
Yeah.
building to the school with,
Yeah.
you know, just astronomical amounts of money.
Said College of Business,
Yeah.
the arms dealer.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the faculty turned it down.
Yeah.
Okay, now that's a different system of governance.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the faculty saying, well,
Yeah.
no, we don't want this?
Yeah.
And it wasn't just because of, they thought that, you know, that it was a tawdry enterprise he was
Right.
involved in,
Right.
but it was because of the impact it would have on the cohesiveness of the campus and its physical.
But in that
dimension.
ancient university, the faculty in
Right.
congregation, which is where they ultimately get to
Mhm.
vote on these things, they have an opportunity to do that.
Right.
We don't have an opportunity in congregation for the
Right.
faculty to articulate their voice, a voice, on any issue.
Mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah, well, my experience on the University Senate for a number of years
Yeah.
was that the University Senate approved virtually everything that any student ever brought up.
Yeah.
Even if nobody wanted to oppose the students. But, no, I think it would have been a good idea not to have administrators there. The administrators get to,
Right.
it'd be,
Well, I agree
it's
with
sort of
you.
like having,
Yeah.
it's sort of like having the president as a member of Congress.
Yeah, exactly so. And I think if you didn't have the students there, well, let me go back a step. Having been forced to spend 15 years in the University Senate as the institution's chief academic officer, toward the end of that decade and a half, it used to bother me more and more and more that you had this cluster of administrators in there who all could block vote
Mhm.
on things, and indeed did in most cases. But more importantly, you had these students always sitting down in the front of the room, ranting on and on about one thing or another, and then you had faculty sort of distributed all over the place that never really seemed to have a chance to get together and speak as the faculty. I don't know. I became a real purist about this.
Yeah.
Much like my view, which certainly was at odds with the president, with whom I worked for most of that, well, almost all that period, John Worthen, where I thought there ought to be a faculty member on the Board of Trustees. I mean, there's a faculty member on the Board of Trustees at Hope College, I'm sure there probably is at Knox, and I think there ought to be one on the board at Ball State. And all of my fellow administrators were adamantly opposed to that. I mean, I was a single, minority, although not quiet, but loud voice, even saying to the Board of Trustees and to the president and my colleagues, I think you're wrong. And I think here are the reasons why you're wrong.
Yeah.
And a lot of it had to do with experiences like being at Oxford or coming out of a small liberal arts tradition, where this was very much accepted.
So this comes under the heading of a steering question, you're asking.
Well, yeah.
But I
it
agree with
probably
you.
is. It's really to sound out people who have now retired from Ball State and have them reflect back, some of whom have been involved in Senate, some of whom have not been involved in Senate, and say, well, do you think that we could have done it another way? And it might have been better.
I have always been very turned off about the arguments that there should not be a faculty member on the Board of Trustees. I thought it made no sense whatsoever. It sort of said, you are a hireling, and no more.
Yeah.
And I don't think that was appropriate at all.
I think you're right.
So,
Well, let me get one last topic in here of this wonderful conversation, and that is, how do you view the relationship between town and gown? And do you think that it's changed during the time that you've been the faculty at Ball State?
I think it's a complex relationship. And it's a love-hate relationship. The only experience I have similarly, I guess, would be at Penn State, where that was the reason for the town to be it was called State College.
Right. That's pretty blunt. Yeah.
And where do you put it? You put it in the geographic center of the state. You call it State College. You put the university. And there was a split there. There was a split there as well. But the university was the big dog there. Here, there are a lot of possible interpretations of relationship. There's no question but that Ball State University, which is the reason why I'm here, I would not move to Muncie. Okay, just to move to Muncie. But I'm here because of the university, and because the university is here, Muncie is an attractive place to live in every sense. I mean, there are a lot of things. When we moved here, we were moving from Dallas, which was a big city, but we did more cultural stuff here than we did in Dallas because it was more affordable, more accessible. How many New York plays can you afford to go to if you're an assistant professor?
CCNY.
Yeah. So that is a strong thing. It has to do with the mutual responsibilities, I guess, if you're talking about things like cooperation and attempts to deal with stuff. The relationships boil over in any number of hot issues, from student housing off campus to other kinds of things. I think it has changed. I tried, back when I was on 205 North McKinley, the Urban and Regional Studies Institute, I put together beginnings of a proposal for student housing downtown in the upper stories, and sent it forward to Tom Kinghorn. And it wasn't just a cold letter or anything like that, but it was rejected out of hand. There's no reason why the university should be involved in that. We wouldn't want to do anything. We wouldn't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 1,000 ways to say no. And so now we're trumpeting kind of the university cooperation with the revitalization of downtown as a major thing. I think that's a change, definitely a change for the better. And that has come about because of improvements in the quality of the town side of the dialogue, and maybe, I don't know what has happened on the part of the university side. Well, I don't know if the university's putting any money in. We talked, in that, remember that whole committee, the mystery?
Yes.
You call it the mystery train?
Yeah, right.
We were all excited about having a Ball State facility downtown, and that never flew. That never flew. And it depends who you ask. There are people, Warren, in the city of Muncie who could not find Ball State. Sure. They have no idea how to get
we
there.
found that in our old Middletown
Yes.
study, working in Middletown.
They have no idea. I don't even know where it is. And one of the people on that committee, who was a minister on the south side, was new to town, asked some of her congregation how to get to First Presbyterian Church. She said, I think it's right next to the university. And they couldn't even tell her where the university was.
Right, yeah.
Lifelong residents here. I I just heard Hurley Goodall say, you know, we were talking to he and I talked to a class a couple of weeks ago, and he said, well, he was temporarily a bit ticked off because he'd come to talk to a night class here, and he couldn't find a place to park, so he parked in the garage, and he'd asked if it was all right to park there, and he said yes. Mm-hmm. And when he came back, he had a ticket on his car. He said, now how does that make me want to come here and talk to a class? I'm giving my night, my time for free, and I get a ticket. So there are all those little
the nuances of town and gown.
But I think that if Ball State wants to be a good university and it wants to retain good faculty, it has to be very concerned about the quality of life in the community. And if the community wants to be a good community, they have to have a strong relationship. It's a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, that's a fair response. Mm-hmm. Well, those are all the questions I have. Is there anything else you would like to add that we might not have touched upon? In the few minutes I might have left on this tape.
Yeah, I don't know. I've talked an awful lot. Probably said at least enough.
Well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to help me with my study.
Good luck.